Recording in progress.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Writing Life. I'm Stephen W. Long. I was thinking about our guest today, and I thought if The Writing Life had a Hall of Fame for overachievers, my guest would be first on the list. He is a professor, a composer, a blogger, a photographer. He's published 4 collections of poetry. He speaks German, English, French and Spanish, reads some Greek and Latin, as well as basic Russian and Italian. And I guess in his spare time, he's also a founding member of the Transatlantic Student Symposium. So, Dr. Philipp Kneis, it's so good to have you. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. So, people who watch the show on any kind of regular basis might see that this is a different setup and precipitated by our friend COVID, which you had, I guess. You're better now? You feel all right?
I'm better now, but it took a little bit of time.
Yeah, we don't like that. There's lots to talk about, but we're really here because of poetry. And so I wanted to kind of start with this. In the introduction to your online poetry, you said you don't know why you write poems. So I'm going to come at that from a little bit different angle and ask you, you have so many ways to express yourself. You write all sorts of things, including music. What does poetry offer that maybe the other media don't? What can you do with poetry?
I think it feels like I have the ability to leave out whatever is not necessary in language.
Okay.
And to turn language into music. As you have noticed, probably I focus more on meter than rhyme.
Yes.
And so it's this odd way between speaking, prose, and music that poetry allows for.
Oh, that's a great answer. I have said that to me, poetry is distilled language. And I think when you talk about leaving things out, all the unnecessary bits, which you've done. To give people a sense of that, we talked about, you have so many poems, but we talked about the possibility. Are you okay to read that to folks and then we can discuss it?
Yes. Okay. It's called The Possibility of a Poem. I know there's something that wants to emerge, to come out, to see the page. Some words have formed or are still forming. I try to catch them once they get loose. Will I capture them correctly in the stream of consciousness? Are there words I'm overlooking, others I pretend to see? How will they sound? Do they have a wish? Shall rhyme they, inside, outside, in the end, in the beginning? Or should they float freely? For rhyming is a tricky thing, dictates some patterns that may perhaps distract, while, as a note, elect to sound in this specific way, where poets are supposed to say things like they are an artifice. And while we do, don't we then miss that all these games are just distractions? Agreement for agreement's sake, beauty, it's hoped, for beauty's own sake, so that in the end, such learned a person could demonstrate well how dactyls can lead you to heaven or hell. But what do the words want? What does the poem want? What's wanted, what's needed is right here, right now, some sense to be coming, and quickly. So then, Adorno once said, yes, that's where I'm going, that after Auschwitz there could be no poems any longer. A commandment he proceeded to later ignore, and why should we not both listen and then ignore? Poetry at a certain point will have to stop and seize and behold and watch. Just take in, just hover in the air of terror, of hell, of the utter impossibility of thinking poetically. For there are times when poetry must stand and quietly weep and watch closely and just be a witness. So that after that which lacks all language, after that which is, should, must be unspeakable, words shall once again roar and spout and scream out and howl and weep eventually. For the human condition was just violated, while the words were silent and something else in us, something unspeakable, was doing the talking yet again. And art was witness. Our soul, for art is our very soul, it speaks to it, hears it, lives in it. Our very dear soul is violated by this life here on earth, amongst this hell of our making. Yes, it is us who bring this about, this perversion of what should it mean to be human. And so am I sitting here at night, during the night of our life, in one of our in one of our quite darkest moments. Am I really sitting here quietly asking, you tell me, O Muse, I ask you, like my ancestor in spirit asked once before, Andra mu enepe musa, tell me, O Muse of a man, tell me maybe of all of us humans and how we are supposed to be able to live in times like these, in times but lightest, in times but darkest at the same time. So as I am sitting here in this all-hour night in the Garden of Gethsemane, while asking about the possibility of a poem, the poem is asking me instead about the possibility of humanity. And I shall weep, for in this here moment I simply have no answer to give, and the words stay silent once more.
Well, thank you, Philip. That you have so many poems. Obviously, I have not read them all, but the ones that I've read are so weighty as this is. And this now makes about the sixth time I've gone through this. And I get a little bit more each time, but there's so much there. Which brings me to another thing I read on your website, and that is the impetus for these poems tends to be a word or a phrase. And when I read your work, I don't think that. I don't pick up that word or phrase. What I get is more thematic, is more a concept. Could you talk a little bit about that difference?
Well, I think it depends, and I'm maybe not the best authority on what motivates me to write. And I mean, it's an odd feeling. I don't believe that they are literally muses, but there is something that really wants to come out. And sometimes it can be a word I'm thinking of, sometimes it can be a feeling, sometimes it's a theme, and it depends a little bit on how long the poem is supposed to be. So sometimes I have rather long poems, they're composed of smaller units, and I have to plan this in advance. This year came about relatively spontaneously, so it flows from this idea of what is a poem supposed to be, what does it want, and then I come to this moment indeed of saying, well, is it appropriate to create poetry? And when Adorno said this, of course, he thought about poetry as something that should be pleasing. And we see that poetry changes a little bit, or art in general changes a little bit always when you have big world crises.
Yes.
Yeah, so Adorno, of course, reflects on the Holocaust and World War II. We know that Guernica changes things. In classical music, we already noticed that some things change already during Mahler and then right after Mahler, definitely. And so if there is something that can't be expressed sometimes, and I think that was the basic idea here, and how to salvage this. And yes, it's weighty, but sometimes so is life.
When you say, when poetry must stand and quietly weep and watch closely and just be a witness, to me that sort of capsulizes what you said. Well, at least this work, this piece, is not to be dashed through. I think the reader has to think about it, as maybe you intended.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I read it maybe a little bit more quickly for interest of time. And yes, ideally, people can spend more time on this. Yes.
Yeah. I want to move on to just I didn't know this word until I read it in your blog or in your website, and that's the word metrum. And you talked a little bit about meter versus rhyme, which is more important. Metrum is part of the meter, isn't it?
Yes, that may just be me not knowing what the English word was when I wrote this.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's just the Latin way of saying it. But what this means is meter.
Yeah.
Meter.
Well, I see I think I see, and I'm unschooled in this, but you're a composer, and I think that there's a real synergism between your written work and your composition. Would you agree to that?
Yes, there should be, but oddly, I haven't been able to write songs yet. So it's the strangest thing that when I think musically, I think more in melodies. I mean, I play the violin, not the piano. Many people play either guitar or piano, and they think in chords. I think in melodies. But I don't. I think music in some ways is different from poetry. In that, I mean, the words dictate maybe how they are read in a poem, but the way music flows has its own logic. That's why it's a different medium.
Having said that, I was thinking about you have categories that we can look up, and there's in stylistic devices and authorship. If I can just read your words, there's a section that says, go on, try to find stylistic devices, and perhaps you're going to find them. Go on, try to ask for my motivation behind these devices, and I'm sure you will certainly come up with something like that. Go on, search for a specific pattern, you'll find it. Well, this is prose, but it's very poetic. And again, to me, it's almost a drum beat, which is back to your music. So I think however these expressions come out, it is certainly you.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
I think the biggest worry writers have is that they subconsciously channel others.
Of course.
I think when I wrote this, I was thinking more of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and so that may imitate some of that style too, because he has this very poetic way of writing. And I actually think his essays are more poetic than his poems, funny enough.
Yeah. I read somewhere, and I neglected to, you have a lot of volume of work out there, and I couldn't find it again. But it seemed to me that you're highly influenced by classical poetry, and maybe even across languages. Again, would you agree with that, and maybe talk a little bit about what came before? You talked about Ralph Waldo Emerson. What came before? Or what are you influenced by that came before?
Well, the weightiness certainly comes from, I mean, the German author Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who people mostly know through his 2 volumes of Faust. So this is, of course, the story of a scholar who, in his frustration, sells his soul to the devil. And that explains maybe some weightiness, although Goethe can also be very funny. And he's typically who people grow up with in Germany, or used to. I'm certainly also then interested in American literature, and there it is typically the time of the American Renaissance that I feel most closely inspired by. So that would be the essays of Emerson, then of course Melville, and mostly probably Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, and then later a little bit Allen Ginsberg. So these would be authors that maybe are most central to how I think poetically. A little bit also Edgar Allan Poe. So in that sense, probably a little old-fashioned. I prefer poems that do still have some sort of meter. I don't necessarily always care about rhyme. I used to more than I do now, so things keep changing over time.
You talked about language, and again, I don't propose to be an expert on this, but when you, much of your language is formal, and yet there's sometimes not a juxtaposition, may be not the right word, but untraditional sequence. And I wondered, I'm sure that that's not accidental. Are you trying to catch us, make us pay attention? What are you doing there?
Well, I would assume sometimes it has to do with English not being my first language.
Yes.
But I think even when I wrote in German, I wasn't quite using language in a normal way, but I think there has to be something in poetry that takes you out of the way you would speak normally. Otherwise, it would just be speech. I mean, poetic speech should aim to take people out of the normal, to give them a different way to relate to ideas. And so I don't know whether I do this necessarily consciously. I tend to write something and then most of the time leave it as is. I do edit, but mostly for meter and shift some things around here and there. But oftentimes I leave it as it came to me. And I can't tell you necessarily that it's always a conscious choice. I notice too sometimes when I think about how I write, I typically don't seem to write about myself a lot. It's more about ideas, and I think that's where the more conceptual language comes in.
Yeah. Okay. I was also wondering, and before we started, you and I talked a little bit about the difference between English and German, and I don't know that I'm using this word right, but polyglot. I think English maybe in some cases qualifies for that. But because you are multilingual, how does, let me get the whole thought out. This must be an advantage, I would think, to you. And English doesn't have the genders, but I think in a Romance language, Spanish maybe, you can, particularly in poetry, you could play on, and correct me here, but if the sky is female and the earth is male, or the opposite, I don't know which that is, but you can use those things where we don't have it in English. Could you talk a little bit about how languages influence you and guide you and give you extra tools maybe?
Well, the more languages you know, the more at a disadvantage you are. And in the end, I end up not knowing the word or any word at all.
Oh, interesting.
So that already doesn't help. Then if I stay with the words for sun and maybe moon, in German, sun is female, moon is male, which is odd because
yes.
in Greek and Latin, it's the opposite. And most mythology sees the sun as the male principle and the moon as the female principle, at least from a European perspective.
Right.
And so that ends up being confusing. And so it depends then on what word I would use. It's then easier to shift maybe to the Latin word or to another word if I want to play with the notion of gender. In the end, I think I'm swimming in this kind of language soup, and whatever word comes out feels natural at the moment. Sadly, probably not for the reader all the time. But it is really this kind of idea that each word in each different language, as you rightly said, somehow works differently. It's almost like you have these different ecosystems and different things are tied to it. So if you think of certain words in English, automatically other words flow with that. If you think about them in a different language, it works differently. Mm-hmm. And English, I mean, the beauty of the English language is that it contains so many words from so many other languages in it. To really learn English, you almost have to look at the Latin, the Greek, the French, the German, and even native roots. I mean, without that, you don't get a full grasp of it. So in a certain sense, I'm interested in language because of my interest in poetry and because of my interest also in the English language. It's like you go down these different alleys of where the words come from, and this etymological quest just makes the experience deeper.
Mm-hmm. I think this is relevant. Again, I believe before we started here, you and I talked about synonyms, and that I think you said in German there are no synonyms?
No, in German there are synonyms.
Okay.
So you can, in official use, you're only supposed to use Germanic origin words and no Romance origin words. Whereas in English, it's really tough to find true synonyms. Every word has a different nuance.
A shading of meaning.
Yeah.
I believe this quote is attributed to Mark Twain. He said, the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. So we need the right word. Yeah. Before we move on away from language, again, I feel like your toolkit is so much bigger than most of us. Aside from poetry, do you think it affects the way you see the world? Maybe you're not expressing this, maybe you're not verbalizing it, but I wonder if you think you have a broader grasp, maybe, of the human condition?
I don't know. I mean, I feel the more you know, the less you know. And I mean, I'm not trying to humble brag here, but it's really the confusion only gets worse. I once heard a talk by some scholar, and she ended every talk with, in the beginning we were confused and didn't know much. Now we are still confused, but at a much higher level. And I think that's really what's going on. I will never pretend to really know more, because you're not really much happier the more you know. I mean, and everything asks more questions. And I mean, maybe that's helpful, maybe not, but I don't know. I find it difficult to say that it helps to have this background in all these different other things, because in the end, I think maybe what's the most interesting is that we are all the same in not really knowing. We can all approach life, we can all approach whatever truth, but the best position, I think, is to just acknowledge that you're always a seeker, and that if you pretend to know or pretend to know better than anybody else, I think you're just asking for a cosmic joke happening to you.
Yes. I've heard something the other day. You were talking about happiness, and a fellow said that happiness is expectation fulfilled. And he, as an example, used medieval peasants who, by our standards, would have had a horrible life, and yet, by all indications, they were fairly satisfied because they didn't expect much. And I wondered, and I'm going to relate this to your situation, not that you expected, but you have so much to draw on. How in the world can you fulfill these expectations or all this possibility? And that's rhetorical. You don't have to answer, but I wonder if, given this broad scope, this observation, if it's just difficult to corral it all.
Well, I don't know. I think people are obsessing a lot about happiness, and they do believe that if this and this happens, I'll finally be happy. I think I've come to believe that even though there are circumstances in which it's very difficult to be happy, in many cases, happiness is a choice. And I think the quote you had at the beginning, that it's expectations met, I mean, you can manage your expectations too. You can choose to say, this is it, and I have to now see myself as somebody that accepts life as it is. Whether happiness always comes in, I don't know. I've noticed that many people who should be happy because they have more than everything are curiously not always happy.
Correct. Yeah. I think you used the word acceptance, and I was thinking of appreciation, which maybe is maybe not synonyms, but similar. And again, for comparison, if we would look outside, and I say we, and I mean almost all Americans, we are so blessed. So that's my pitch. Philip, before we run out of time, I just wanted to touch on your musical compositions. I think you may have answered some of this, but I listened to some. It's very moving. Do you play the instruments, or how does that come about?
No, I have a notation program that does it for me. And
Okay.
so, no, I wish I could play all those instruments, but it certainly is not a real orchestra. I have some friends who know how to program more professional music instruments, but this is just a notation software that's doing the thing.
I didn't know that even existed, so I'm going to have to try. Well, so notation, in other words, you write the music and it translates it? Is that
Yes.
how that works? Okay.
Yes, I write the score and the computer can play it.
But you do play violin?
Yes.
Okay. I remember somebody talking about Chuck Berry's song or songs, and that when they went back and analyzed it, they thought, well, this was composed on piano, not guitar. And it turned out that, in fact, his pianist was the one composing a lot of this. I mean, I wouldn't know, but you talked about what chords and melody, that they're different. Yeah, so.
Well, I think it depends on how you see a melodic line. And I'm just noticing sometimes the way some music works is very, very chord focused. So I don't think of the chord first, I think of the melodic line first. And for instance, when you look at Bruckner, you just know he played the organ because it sounds like he really wants to play the organ, but he uses the orchestra.
Okay.
And so there's some interesting renditions also of some of the symphonies for the organ. And then you have some composers who use guitars, and that can be fascinating too. But yeah, I think your instrument that you're familiar with, that determines a little bit what kind of music you would write if you were to write music. That's
your toolkit.
Yep.
That's where that comes from. Dr. Philipp Kneis, we're out of time. This was something much anticipated. I have a lot more to ask you, but maybe we can do it another time.
Always happy to do it another time.
All right. And be well. I know that you're getting better, but glad you're on that road.
And thank you for everybody having make this possible, and you be well as well.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Folks, that's another one, The Writing Life. I'm Stephen W. Long. Would love to, I'm so lonely. Write to me, stephenwlong.com, and we'll just see you next time on The Writing Life. Bye-bye.